session. Thank you so much for joining us again this month. My name is Aprajita and I work with the Mobilization Lab. Please feel free to introduce yourself on the YouTube chat room. Tell us where are you from, your name, which organization or group that you work with. And we are sorry for starting the session a couple of minutes late. We were facing some tech issues, but all settled and good now. Today's MobLab Live conversation is about understanding the if, how, and why of blockchain for social good. And we have an amazing group of guests who will talk about blockchain technology, talk about their work, lessons, and examples, and maybe enable us to learn how to use the technology for social change. We are joined by Daisy Ozen, who's the founder of Blockchain for Social Justice and has been using blockchain technology to work with the marginalized communities. Our second guest is Veronica Garcia, who is the CEO and founder of Bitlumens, which brings solar power and water to rural areas using blockchain technology. And our last guest is Lee Brenner, Chief Strategist Officer at Global Blockchain Business Council, and comes with years of experience in the use of technology on civic and political engagement. And we have Michael Silberman from the Mobilization Lab team who will moderate the session. It's an hour-long session, so please keep sharing your thoughts and questions on the YouTube chat room on the event page, as well as keep tweeting using the hashtag MobLabLive. We'd love to hear from you and take some of your questions in the second half of the session, about like last 10-15 minutes. And yeah, we look forward to hear from you. And on that note, I will invite Michael to start the session.
Thanks, Aprajita. I will add my voice to your welcome here. It's exciting to see folks chiming in here from India and let's see, London, New York, Spain, Buenos Aires. So please do, Seattle, hello. Please keep the hellos coming. My job here is to really serve up your questions, your thoughts into this conversation as our host, and I'll be doing that with Aprajita and Ted from the MobLab team. As many of you know, our goal here at the MobLab is to try to stay collectively one step ahead of the strategies, tactics, tools, and technologies that enable us to win big social change. And so, of course, blockchain is just one of those topics where we just keep hearing about, it's a new technology, and we thought this would be a good chance to figure out how do we talk to some folks who are using it effectively, who know something about it, to figure out what we might do with it. I think most of us, from what I can tell from those who have put in questions, have some big strategic questions about how it might be useful to our work, and a lot of us just really have honestly no idea about what it is and why or if it could matter in what we're doing. And I think we're lucky to be in conversation with some people who I think will have some good insight for us. And my goal here is for us to all leave with a better sense of how, again, blockchain can be more than just a buzzword, but actually something that we can be a little bit smarter in our decision making and thinking about our social change, advocacy, and campaigning strategies. So yeah, another big welcome to Daisy, Lee, and Veronica, coming to us from many different time zones, from the West Coast of the US, where it's very early, to Switzerland, where I know Veronica is right now, and everyone here working globally. So why don't we just get started we'll have a chance we're gonna dive deeper into each of our guests have some incredible projects and areas of expertise. But let's just level the playing field of our understanding if we can, and just start at the very basics in terms of what is blockchain. I feel like we're hearing a lot about it, certainly in the context of cryptocurrencies and new forms of currencies. But Veronica, when we were talking last, you said you have children. I hope I'm not revealing anything here, but you said you summarized how you were trying to explain it to me, not as in a way that I was able to understand it. Maybe that's a reflection of my level of intelligence, but maybe you could just tell us, how do you talk about blockchain to your children?
So I try to explain it in a very simple way, actually. I would tell them I would engage in a financial transaction with you, and then I will spread a copy of that particular transaction with different parties. So let's assume we have different tables, and each table has one party. We will give each of these parties one copy, and then it's very, very difficult to come and take all those copies at once. I mean, it's very difficult to hack. So this is, I don't get into the consensus mechanisms and into the protocols, but I think it's a very easy way to let them know that the core of the system has security, privacy, and transparency, because so many people around the world are involved in it.
How about you, Lee and Daisy? You guys are both involved in having to talk to people all day long about something that many people don't understand yet. What additional language do you both use? Daisy?
Well, when I talk about blockchain, the way that I explain it is I break down its four core components, which is the decentralization aspect. So the way I explain it is, instead of you going to the bank or a system to handle your transactions, you can actually work on a network that's peer-to-peer, where it's just between you and other individuals and you have the same amount of authority and power. Two, it's distributed, meaning across an entire network, we can all see each other's data and transactions, and how we're exchanging information with one another. It's interoperable, meaning that I can now exchange data and information across two different systems that are unrelated, and I can start to compare data and how they match with each other within those two systems. And then I would say that the anonymous part, meaning that people don't need to know my identity for me to be able to get involved.
Nice and clear, 4 elements. I appreciate that. Lee, what else comes up for you?
We explain it. I mean, we're constantly talking to CEOs and heads of state and people at the highest levels of government. So it's often like explaining it to children. We talked about just as Veronica and Daisy were explaining, we like to think of it as, blockchains are a platform. They're like global notaries, right? So right now you transact, and often either there's a middleman or a person that needs to verify the transaction. But because it's built in to the structure of the platform, as Daisy was saying, it's a peer-to-peer transaction that everyone trusts the system. And as Veronica was saying, there are copies of that transaction that are transparent. So that aspect is everyone sees that transaction took place. They don't necessarily know, as Daisy was saying, who was on either side if it's on the public blockchain. But the idea that these transactions can happen, whether it is a cryptocurrency, which everyone hears about, which we can get into, or it's a transaction of a home, right? If you want to sell your home or verify you own this piece of land, and no one else can dispute it.
Well, let's get into some of those other examples, because I think you're right. We do often hear all about the Bitcoin, and even the language you all used has a lot of currency related, security, transparency, a lot of transaction, a lot of language that we are familiar with from a financial perspective, and that may be relevant in our social change work too. But I know there are. I think we're interested in this session really finding those other examples. So what are some of your favorite examples of blockchain in use from a social good or a social change context? And we can go in reverse order here, Lee, while you still have the mic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think one great example that I like to use, which I think will resonate with the audience, and obviously Veronica will talk about her project as well, but one that has come out of Australia is called Power Ledger, right? And if you think about it, I know a lot of people on this call, I'm sure, are very focused on climate change and use of solar power. But so they basically created a system that allows, where in Australia, a lot of homes have solar panels, right? So a lot of people were leaving the traditional grid, but they created a way for people to sell that power, extra power that they might be creating on their home, to their neighbor, right? Which wouldn't necessarily be possible without a blockchain-based solution, right? Where they're also then the meters are connected to the blockchain. They're also then connected to the electric grid, and so the industry is interested in this technology because most people were leaving the grid there, and they need to show usefulness for it. So then people are able to, without getting into the specifics of the technology, they're using the blockchain to conduct those transactions neighbor to neighbor, right? So someone can buy extra solar power, so that's increasing the potential of the solar power transactions and really creating mini grids in neighborhoods. And now they're trying to expand to other parts of the world. They have a project that started at Northwestern University here in the United States, and there are examples of that in the power space and energy consumption, and thinking about how a trusted peer-to-peer transaction can take place. Another great example I like to use is governments using it for their land trust, right? So right now, think about, so the government of Georgia, the country of Georgia, implemented a blockchain-based land registry. But I think about Haiti, right? The building that housed all the land documents was one of those that was destroyed. So people can't actually prove. I mean, think about it now in places where we have digital assets and everything else. But even then, how do you really prove that you owned your home if the paperwork is gone? So if the government can create a land registry that allows you to say, look, I own this land, we know when the transactions take place, or I don't own this home. If something happens where the paperwork is gone, those documents are immutable. They are not changeable. You can see who owned what, and they're not open to corruption, right? So it's not like someone sitting in the land registry office can say, oh, actually my cousin is the one who owns this land, even though you say you've had it for 3 generations, right? With a system like it makes it impossible to do that. So in cases of natural disasters or government corruption or anything else, these systems are immutable.
Gotcha, and there's some redundancy as well I'm hearing in that, right? Because it's not in that one office down the street.
Right.
Daisy, what about you? What kind of examples are you inspired by that help illustrate what the power and potential of blockchain is for us today?
Okay, well, one project that I like is the SELA project, SELA, and that was started by Sustainability International. And the way that project works is basically it's in the Delta region in Nigeria that has been impacted by a lot of environmental degradation because of the oil industry. So what they do is they have the people who live in the surrounding villages, they will go and clean up some of these areas. They take before and after pictures, log that on the blockchain, and then the SELA staff deploy tokens to folks. Another project that I like that's up and coming is, let's see, I like the Acoin project, and it's Acon's token where basically they are utilizing the blockchain first for energy, actually, and then there's a token on top of it in order for people to have some type of intercommunal economic system where I can use this Acoin token that's like powering my village to also trade food and clothing and stuff like that with other merchants. And then another project that I've seen, I wouldn't say, I feel like this is like a double-edged sword, but it's I think it was the World Economic Forum. They did a highlight on this, and it's the refugee camp that's run on blockchain technology, and the way that it's used is for identity management, because there's something called identity genocide, where when war happens, the first thing that's destroyed is people's paperwork and their ability to identify themselves, right? So with the blockchain technology, what it does is it actually scans your iris. You look into a camera and your iris is literally like your form of identity, and that's how you're able to get like your rations, food, etc. So that one I'm a little bit how would I say, it's a double-edged sword, I believe,
right?
Because I definitely see how that can go left. And some other platforms that I do like, just outside of their social impact are, I really like the Ripple platform, which is helping us speed up transactions. Yeah, so those are some of the tokens and platforms that I like right now that are out there.
That's great, and we'll be sharing links to these projects with the help of our guests after the call as well, of course. And of course, use the chat if anyone does have additional examples or is looking these up online as we speak and wants to share links. And if you're just joining, we also have the Twitter hashtag. I didn't mean to pronounce Twitter so strangely there. Twitter hashtag MobLab Live. Veronica, any other? I know we're going to hear more about BitLumens, which is a great case study in and of itself shortly. But are there other ones from examples that you would want to throw into the mix here?
So I want to also agree with Daisy. I think that the best one I have seen so far is the UN refugee camp in Jordan, where there are over 75,000 refugees, and then they get through a biometric device, they get identified, and then instead of using any credit card or cash, they call iPay. It's called at the World Food Program building blocks. That's the way that it's called at the Satari refugee camp. So I think that's the best that I have seen, because it has been really tested really well. They know what the issues on scalability are. And they try to improve that on that. And then, of course, they use it for groceries, so there is no double spending. There is accountability for whatever you're buying. And of course, this allows international organizations to keep better track of all the groceries that are being delivered to this type of camps. And that's really a huge advantage. I think whatever you can add transparency on donations for these big international organizations that are really tough to manage and operate, it's a big plus.
Yeah, well, maybe we can I appreciate that, and I think that be worth diving into that a little bit further. And Lee, you have such an interesting overview given your role at the Blockchain Council. I know it's called the Global Blockchain Business Council, but I know part of your mission is also about supporting how do you say it on the site, the adoption of blockchain by global change makers to create a more secure, equitable, and functional society. And I really love that language, because I think it does line up with a lot of what those of us here as change makers are thinking about. And I was wondering, so we started talking about some technology, and elements of the technology. We've talked about some examples of the technology applied to social change. What are some of, I guess, the values that help us connect the dots, I guess, and some of the examples you've seen between the sorts of things we might be caring about as social good doers and social change campaigners? We're talking about things like transparency, accountability. What are how does that play out? I guess, broadly speaking, strategically, if we have people here from environmental context, development context, anti-corruption, your past work has involved civic engagement, civic participation. Help us connect some of the dots, if you can.
So if you think about it, our goal at the GBBC Blockchain Business Council is really to get the business community, those who are developing these technologies, to the larger scale organizations who are exploring the usage of these technologies, to working with governments, large and small, to say, look, this is potentially going to be an underlying fabric of many of the different things that we're going to do. It's not necessarily a silver bullet that's going to solve all issues, but the application of it beyond the headlines of what you hear about Bitcoin or some of the cryptocurrencies where people are obviously making money on those types of transactions, the actual broader use case is enormous, just big as potentially the internet was when that was created. And we also then like to say, look, we're in early days, right? It's still 1993 of the internet, right? We're still playing. Things might be moving a little much faster than they were then, but it's still very early, and we don't know what the major platforms are going to be when things all shake out. We don't know what the killer apps are going to be, and I use apps as applications, not necessarily in the same term as apps. And it's part of the issue with nomenclature is even in the idea of the traditional sense of cryptocurrencies, the originators start using the term mining, right? We've dealt with people in the space, and we start talking about mining, and they're like, no, we understand what mining is, and actually mining, right?
Right.
So in any sense, we talk about that nomenclature, but we really try to talk to these groups to think about what are the real world case studies that are out there, either both from a business application, whether it's from supply chains, and you look at it from, there's different angles of the supply chain. Is it tracking grain from one place of the world and literally one section of the farm and knowing exactly where that has gone along supply chain to get to a store or to get to the consumer, and being able to track that, trace it, know exactly where those where that piece of all that data is at any given time, and then also to be able to execute smart contracts along the supply chain, so farmers can get paid faster and they don't necessarily have to extend as much credit because they know that their piece of that supply chain is has been finished. They're able to execute a smart contract that lives on the supply chain and automatically executes based on certain parameters happening. All actors trust that system, and thus different aspects of the supply chain. Making sure that workers along the supply chain are getting paid in real time, right? Obviously, making sure that there are workers' rights built into those types of transactions. So that's one aspect of how we work, with business. Thinking about it from different. We talk to governments all the time. One, who are looking to us, again, large governments from the EU and the US and China and others, to smaller governments like St. Lucia and Mauritius and other places that are looking at how they can potentially use this technology either to foster economic development for their citizens and bring businesses to their country and potentially be a place where some of these businesses set up shop, but also then how do we use the technology, and governments come to us and say, how are we actually using it for, like those land trust examples, or e-voting, or making sure that it's secured in a way that everybody can trust. If we're coming out of corruption, and a lot of governments that are former Soviet Union countries are starting to use it. So they're looking at it from two different angles of how that, especially from that civic engagement or that social impact space can be applied. And we really try to explore it from that angle, because I think this technology, because it is so borderless and has the potential to be so impactful, a lot of major players in industry and governments are really trying to look at it from a broader perspective beyond just lowering the bottom line or increasing the bottom line and making sure that profits are increased.
And so, a lot of the people, when you talk about, I think you're alluding to some, with the supply chain questions here. And when you talk to businesses, I'm curious, so many of us on the call are involved in various types of corporate campaigning to bring, fairness and transparency, not just living wages to people who are at the end of a supply chain, but also, environmental transparency about, where are we sourcing things, to what extent do you see businesses, what is the future of the need for this kind of, for even campaigning in this area? Do you see, is the future one where all, these multinational corporations who are supplying, or grocery stores who are supplying, from 10 different partners along the way, it's all going to be transparent and visible to us through the internet or as a consumer?
It has the technology has the potential to do that. Obviously, it is politically agnostic, like any, so is Twitter and Facebook, right? Officially, right? But all these
right. But in practice, right,
are clearly using these technologies. So as Daisy was saying, it's a double-edged sword with any, especially these technologies can be used. But because of the transparency aspect, a lot of early criticism of blockchain and Bitcoin was that, criminals are using it. But because of the transparency of the transactions, that's actually how governments have been able to start to track those transactions. And there have been actors, good actors from the business community and the government community have come together and create something called the Blockchain Alliance that is really working with federal authorities and folks just to make sure that bad actors who are trying to use this technology to commit crime can be traced. So there are, you know, with everything, we recognize that it's, you know, there are plenty of people in the ecosystem that want it to be completely off the grid and live on islands and have no central authority whatsoever. We recognize that society to function, there's going to need to be good actors, and we think it's important for both governments, businesses, and citizenry to really be able to see, have transparency, not necessarily without loss of identity, though.
I'm going to throw a last question your way before we go to Daisy. What about elections? I mean, that's something that seems to be, you know, an issue. There's issues of verification. People in every, you know, around the world, we're seeing issues with this questions of fair elections, and of course, you know, battles with authoritarianism around the world. Do you see a future? What's the latest in conversation around blockchain being used to authenticate or verify voting?
There is potential for it to be used for voting. There's a project that the United States government actually used, working with a group called, our sister organization called the Blockchain Trust Accelerator, that basically is trying to facilitate secure absentee voting, which is basically for military veterans coming out of a small part of West Virginia. They start small, see how they can facilitate that voting for them in the West Virginia election. So it's a test, but the idea that it is transparent and potentially could be utilized. In the end, you still need a front end system to have people actually somehow vote, right? And but if it's connected to a system where you can trace it and it is immutable and it cannot be changed, and you can, you know, every individual has an ID, and if you're combining that with potentially some sort of activity, identity that's involved, there is potential for it. And I think, you know, especially, you know, you look at Estonia as a great model of the way they've used digital technology. They've started to do some voting on the blockchain.
Thanks, Lee. I think you've opened up a few different areas for us. You know, Daisy, you lead Blockchain for Social Justice. You have a, you know, public policy background. I think when, you know, you seem to be keenly aware of that other side of the use of technology. So I'm curious, when you hear about or even propose good examples like putting refugees into a database, or a blockchain check database, or hearing about voting, you know, or putting asking vulnerable communities and populations to basically be adding themselves to systems like this, what's your reaction?
I think my reaction is twofold. On one end, we know that we need to have mass adoption anyways, right? In order for this technology to really be able to have its full potential for use. But I also understand the ways in which surveillance and data mining have negatively impacted some vulnerable populations. So I think something for me is we really just have to make sure that we're educating people on what their options are and what they're getting themselves into when they do decide to put their data and information and their resources onto the blockchain. So that's where I come from in that perspective. So with the Blockchain for Social Justice, we're really educating people on, okay, what blockchain technology is, how it can be used, and how it can positively or negatively impact our community. So I think in terms of your question earlier, how it can impact marginalized, underserved communities, one is the surveillance piece is huge, right? We're already experiencing that in our communities where a lot of our data is being mined without our permission, and then the data is then used to make some assumptions or come to certain conclusions in order to help different companies increase their marketing push or their revenue. Then there is the financial exclusion part. Not every person who's in a marginal, not everyone has a smartphone, right? I feel like that's a privilege that we fail to realize. Not everyone has an iPhone, not everyone has an Android. Some people are still having to depend on something that we call the Obama phones, which are the phones that you can get for free if you get government assistance, right? And then they don't have the capacity to be able to tap into some of these dApps that we're using to access the network. And then I'm thinking about private keys, right? Some folks, what about if the little money that I do have, the little resources that I do have, I put it onto the blockchain in order to try to reap some type of benefit, and then I lose my private key, right? Which I
Right.
know that there's something called Kairos, which is out right now, which is basically a facial recognition software for your wallet. So instead of you getting a private key, it's just your face. That's your private key. And while that can kind of help with some of those issues with wallet design and usability, it does bring up another question in terms of what I was talking about earlier, which is the data and the surveillance. And I think something is the greed. Some of these ICOs that we've been seeing, which are probably going to now, the word that's probably going to be used next is utility token offering or security token offering. Some of these platforms, they are fraudulent. And because they've been able to pay to get recognition and visibility and like advisors that have credibility, they're able to really float along in the blockchain space, but end up running some of these ICOs or whatnot, and taking people's money and running with it. And then also we have the thing with exchanges. Now we see a whole bunch of exchanges being hacked. That doesn't help because, again, if I'm already talking about we're dealing with communities that have less economic resources to begin with,
Yeah.
and they start trying to enter this industry, and then they are dealing with platforms that are getting hacked, that are taking their data and whatnot, it adds just a level of distrust that is already present because of our interaction and legacy with economic disenfranchisement and different systems of marginalization. So these are some of the things that I'm kind of like worried about and thinking about as we do try to push for mass adoption and educate communities.
So what should, it's really helpful to have you lay all that out. I guess, I feel like we've learned our lesson to some extent hopefully with some of the social media platforms, right? That new technologies, as Lee said, can all be good, used for, for good or not so good, right? And so technology is not neutral. How can you have on this call, for example, dozens of advocates and campaigners and people who I think get the fundamentals of some of the issues you're bringing to the table, but how do we make sure we don't miss the boat with blockchain in terms of advocating for preventing some of the issues that we've now seen, the misuse of the technology that actually ends up going against us rather than and the communities that would be most impacted then. What would you say? I guess what are the things we need to be keeping an eye out for collectively or working towards? And I know you've laid that's part of what Blockchain for Social Justice is all about, but how can what do we all need to be doing as part of that?
Well, I think what we can do is, can we develop a declaration for our industry? I know that someone's working on like a blockchain code of ethics. We need to start creating more of those specifically for certain blockchain industries, because it's going to be a little bit different from blockchain in like the agricultural industry versus blockchain protocols for the financial industry. So making sure that those different industries have some type of ethics or morality that can guide their behavior and guide their decision making and guide the development and creation of their platforms. And then I think it's also the accountability piece. I think for one, it's some of this also relies on the investors, right? And the folks who are financing some of these projects that are causing more harm than good in the ecosystem. So how do we develop some type of rubric that investors and whatnot can use for their due diligence, right? For different projects. Like, okay, this is what you want to look for in a team. This is what you want to look for in a project to make sure that it is staying in alignment with values and principles that are going to help our industry move forward. I think also we may know some people who are shady in the blockchain space or who are running projects that are going to hurt certain communities or may have some unintended consequences, right? So I think we should start having conversations with those folks and basically raising awareness about what they can do to help improve their projects, right? That code of ethics that I was talking about earlier, or even what's the rubric for developing a project. And that's what Blockchain for Social Justice, that's something we also do too. We work with some blockchain organizations to help them understand what are some of the unintended consequences for their project so that we can avoid some of those things as we move forward towards scalability and mass adoption. And I think for me personally, we need to just start putting bad actors on display. I think a good example of this is what happened in Puerto Rico with the whole Brock Pierce situation. I saw a documentary that was done about what's going on there. So for some folks who don't know, is these cryptocurrency guys, they went to Puerto Rico in order to escape the SEC for their ICO. They raised more than $1 billion. But now they're bringing all the worst of the worst for the blockchain industry to Puerto Rico. And they're talking about, oh, we're going to reinvent Puerto Rico. That right there has really the undertone of colonialism. You're going to come into someone else's land and community and reinvent something that was already existing before you came. And because of that situation now, there's a lot more awareness being raised about just some of the arrogance and entitlement on behalf of some of founders in the blockchain industry. So I think the more that we put bad actors on display in terms of this is what you shouldn't do, the more that we can weed out some of those bad actors in the ecosystem so we can move forward. Because I heard a statistic here that 70% of ICOs ran in 2017 are now defunct, right? But who was to know if we would have had a mechanism in place beforehand for people like, hey, this is actually how you check if an ICO is going to be worth it. This is how you vet a team. A lot of this wouldn't have happened.
And tell us, some of you have thrown around the term ICO, which I'm pretending to understand. I think we're referring to initial coin offering. Is that? And if so, what does that mean? Give us the very quick and dirty.
Okay. Awesome. So an ICO is basically an initial coin offering. So a token project, before they get to the exchanges, they will offer their token at a lower price for people to be able to buy in. And it's also a way for them to fundraise and finance their project.
Gotcha. Thank you. That was nice and succinct. Last question for you, at least for the moment, Daisy. You've talked about some of the blockchain technologies as kind of a key ingredient or tool for economic sovereignty. And I know earlier we said we might skip away from cryptocurrency. We might not focus too much on cryptocurrency, but you also have done, it seems like, a great deal of work around cryptocurrency and communities that otherwise might not have access to that. Oh, are we still there? Well, we can come back to you, Daisy.
Thank you. I just don't know.
I think we have lost the connection with Daisy momentarily. So we will come back to Daisy.
I would just.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
On your point, it's important to level set because I think it's very easily to get into these terms and explaining what it all is to people who either don't have an lot of background in it, but and aren't living it day to day. So it actually might be a good way for Veronica to give a sense of what a token is, and types of tokens, utility versus, but it might be a good way for Veronica to talk about even Bitlumens, because the different types of tokens and really what it can be used for in a company, how it's being applied in a real world case might be a good way to explain it for people how it can be used.
It's a great segue, and I do want to hear. Take it away, Veronica. We would love to hear more about Bitlumens right now, how it works. You have a case study that I think touches a few different areas. So break it down for us, would you?
Yeah, so what we are doing is we are bringing solar home systems into areas that are not connected to the power grid. And then we are embedded the blockchain for different purposes. One of them, I believe that with the use of Internet of Things and sensors by itself, we really need to integrate an infrastructure that allows security and privacy at the core of its system. And it is something that we have not seen so far with internet, for instance. So whatever we have sensors in place, I'm a big believer that blockchain will help with data management, governance, and the ethic control that Daisy was talking about. This is one thing. And to make it more real, This is actually a big plus for companies that want to actually get into those rural villages. It is quite difficult to get access to that. I mean, just to give you an example, we bring our agents, we train our agents. These are local community members. They will collect KYC data on each of our users. And this is a very common procedure in Africa, for instance, where there are over 20 million solar home systems. And at the end of the payment period, because these solar home systems are paid in installments, at the end of the payment period, users will ask the company to provide them with a certificate saying that they had paid for their microloan. And they will go into a bank and try to open a bank account. Most of the times, the banks do not accept that piece of paper, right? So if we include blockchain into such system, we will provide the whole data to both the financial entity and also to the user. So they will get a credit score. It's some sort of financial ID, I would call it. So you would know, when did you pay? If you were late, your credit score will decrease. Very similar to US terms, I would say. To me, it's important that people understand that if you are asking for a microloan in Mexico, for instance, they will charge anywhere between 50 and 120% interest rate. So yes, while the blockchain might have some challenges, I still believe in very particular cases, the benefits are way higher than the costs. And this is one of them, I believe. So even though you are late paying, it's still better to have this type of data than no data at all. So this is one of our use cases. The second one is through mini grids. People can trade electricity with each other. For instance, if I live close to a mechanic, I can provide the mechanic with my capacity that I have not actually been using. We just focus on off-grid communities. I think, there are 1.2 billion people that do not have access to electricity. I want to bring this type of technologies to those communities that are already paying for kerosene, wood, and candles. They pay anywhere between $10 and $30 per month. And just to charge their phones, they pay $8. So, for instance, if I want to invest in the project, I would just buy tokens. I will collaborate buying tokens. And if I have a family member, let's say in Guatemala, that has one of these devices, I can send the tokens to the device and unlock the device. So this is a pretty transparent process compared to what we currently have. Most people will currently use Western Union that charges 10 to 15% interest on the transactions. We are trying to charge way less than 1% and never go above 1%. We are a for-profit, and I made it this way because I'm a firm believer that governments alone cannot solve the issue on climate change. We do need private investors to get in. And while our ROI might not be crazy high, we are trying to stay anywhere between 8 and 10% and still try to give a steady return, depending on, of course, on how fast we increase our network. And there are many different types of tokens. We qualified in Switzerland as a utility token. I put a lot of effort to be regulated. One of my team members used to be at the IMF. He was at the board of directors there. I think there is an intersection where you can still make things ethical and compliant with regulation. And in the long run, I think that's what it will make most sense. There is no way companies can get around that. And I will encourage everyone that it's into this space to do it at the very beginning. It is challenging. Many ICOs did not take things like KYC on their customers. So they did not take any anti-money laundering type of practices, which is really bad for the industry. And I hope new ICOs or new initial coin offerings move towards that particular space.
So I'm curious, just if we zoom into some of the the villages in Guatemala you're working with, you know, are you, when you're there, are you talking about, are you having to explain blockchain, or is this about
No.
clean energy? Is this just about
I
energy,
mean,
right? Or
so
what's
it's just
the
about
component? Yeah.
so it's just about energy access. I mean, they don't really care if I use blockchain, internet. They don't care at all. The only
Right.
thing they care about is, are you bringing me something that it's useful for
Mm-hmm.
me at a lower price? If yes, then let's go for it. They don't care about
Right.
anything else, right? And if on top
Right.
of that I can grant them access to something that will be useful for them to, for instance, get a microloan backed by BLS tokens, then why not? Right. My point is that these technologies are really cheap and
Sure.
really easy to deploy. If independent power producers would know how much these people pay, how much can we generate in a certain location, and how much are they consuming, we can place decentralized energy systems all over. And I think that's the way to move forward, and not through the grid.
So I don't know if you bump up against some of the, you know, organizations that I know are represented on the call that might be thinking about, you know, economic security, international development, you know, also thinking about the 1.2 billion people without access to electricity, clean energy development, or shifting our use of, you know, clean versus dirty energy. What would you want to see? You know, so you're implementing a solution, right? You're a social enterprise, if that's a fair label. But you know, we have also these organizations here. How would you like to see? How could they help you know, transform? You're a pioneering example, I think, of a new way of doing things that might address some of the actual, you know, economic and environmental issues we're facing. What kind of alliance or support would you want to see from a, you know, whether it's an Oxfam or Greenpeace or any of the groups that may share your ultimate end goal, but are working in very different in ways? Should they be building similar projects, or, you know, connecting people to you, or changing government policy?
I think one of the best things you could do, it's testing the technology. If we want to move fast, we cannot run before we test this. And the technology is by no means perfect. So if they could.
I don't know if others are. Look, we've also lost we have a hiccup with Switzerland. Let's see. Well,
see, technology, as you were saying, you need to test platforms.
That's we've been yeah, this has been an ongoing learning with Google Hangouts. Well, we're down to our last contestant here, Lee, so far.
I think what Veronica was saying is make sure that, you know, we're and I was sort of saying this, that we're in early stages, right? All these things are being tested. There's going to be smaller companies like Veronica's and others that are the startups that are really trying to, you know, find interesting solutions coming from different angles, whether they're social enterprises or not. Something that Daisy was saying before about use of data and those. I met with a company yesterday. It's a startup that has a blockchain patent, and it's basically going to be a market research company. But if you imagine, but the concept is individuals should own their own data. Blockchain could potentially allow where you have a choice to say, I'm willing to sell this part of this data, or I'm going to put this data out there on social media or on your phone or else, but I'm going to know that I'm going to get it's going to be monetized, and I'm going to be paid by these companies that are either going to be using it or that they're going to be sold to market research firms. So there's another way to empower people in an economic way who already are giving their information out and are getting nothing for it, right? They're not getting a credit on their cell phone bill or getting a credit on else, but it's being used. So it's their data, they should be able to use it. Blockchain potentially has the ability to make those transactions both transparent and the ability to give resources to individuals.
I wonder if you might be able to, if that might segue into this question that's come up from Steve, who works on criminal justice reform and is asking, I guess from you have this global perspective about on these projects and various new initiatives. He's asking about the model. What models are there for incentivizing more organizations or people to run blockchain nodes for social good? So we're seeing a lot of these. Obviously, there's a lot of business incentive out there for people to get ahead of this and make some money off of blockchain. But how do you run? Specifically, he's also asking, how do you get people to run a node without relying on a centralized funder?
Right. Well, I think that's. I mean, if you think about even the concept of Bitcoin in the original white paper was based on the idea. All right, it came after the financial crisis. The idea was there should not be this middleman, organization, banks that are charging for the transactions. There's a way to do it without that. So the concept of it, and it has all these nodes and the incentive of securing the network and making sure it is, at least on the public ledger, is a Bitcoin, right, or a partial Bitcoin. That's what you get for solving the problem, making sure it's secure. So, I think there are not every system is going to be based on that, and there's different. And as Veronica was talking about, utility tokens, and Daisy brought that up. There are going to be different incentives, but if you think about, the players, you want to make sure that the players that are be getting involved in the nodes, whether it's for a social justice reason, it's for elections or anything else. I mean, you just have to understand it's not going to solve all problems. You're still going to need people to be pushing for those incentives to make sure that the individuals who are running those nodes, whether it is a financial incentive or just, it'd be great if everyone just said, let's just do it for the good of the world. But the reality is that's not the world we live in. And so you're going to need to have both campaigners and people working on that. But I think there's going to be a lot more of these social impact-based companies that might be for profit, but might still have a major benefit of making sure that there's an incentive. So I think it's just, the system allows for the ability to have transactions that have dual benefit. Maybe there's a financial reward for that because of a token, that you get a piece of a token every time you do something or question, you secure the system, and on the other side of it, somebody's getting electric power that they wouldn't have necessarily had.
That's helpful. I think time for one more here, and and we'll of course summarize. I know we didn't get a chance to properly say goodbye to Veronica or Daisy, but we will obviously include. We're going to follow up with them, getting additional notes or comments or thought that they want to include in the conversation in the follow-up notes and posts that we will include here. But Lee, a lot of us on this call work inside NGOs, nonprofits all over the world. And let me put you on the spot here for a second. And imagine let's pretend you are the campaign director or the digital director of your organization, and you've just been on this call, and now you have to go you're about to have lunch with your executive director or even some members of the board of your organization, and they say, okay, well, I heard you're just on this MobLab call about blockchain. Sounds nice. Obviously, you have a lot of program work to do. There's some immediate issues you need to take care of. I hope you had fun thinking about the future, but let's back to work. And also, is there anything we need to pay attention to? Is there any way in which we've got limited time, limited resources here, but is there anything we really need to pay attention to when it comes to blockchain for the kind of environmental, human rights, social justice work that we're doing? How should we be briefing them?
Well, I think you say, one, I'll be back to work in a second. Give me a second, and I'll. But I think you just basically say, look, we're in early days. I think that's very important to say, right? There isn't necessarily the perfect application. There isn't, think about it in the sense of we're talking about the future of the internet, and Twitter hasn't been invented yet. So I can go out and tweet about the program, but it's not there yet. But you start thinking about the different ways that either as an organization you can partner with some of these companies and say, like, well, how do we take our mission and work with a blockchain-based company that is either working in the space or is a traditional development company, and say, let's brainstorm and think about what is our next campaign. How do we create maybe there's a white labeled solution that is blockchain based that you could roll out to governments, organizations, etc. Whether it's a payment based system or a mobile based system for people that have banking, or something like what Veronica's doing. There are different ways. So it depends on obviously the issue that the organization is looking at. But I think it's important to say to the people in charge that every organization doesn't need to create their own blockchain-based system right now, but there are going to be applications and tools that are going to come out that are based on a blockchain-based system that they might be able to use or champion or help push out in a partnership way to the constituents that they're trying to answer to.
Absolutely.
Nice. We'll give Veronica the last word on this. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I lost you. I'm running out of battery, so sorry.
No problem. We're in our last minute, so.
But I really want to take on what Liz just said, and said that the testing piece, it's really key for each different use case. There are a lot of really good blockchains out there, but not all of them are good for any solution. Like, one has to really try to adopt and test it, the different ones to see what are the costs embedded and how can you actually scale. So coming back to your earlier question on what would I like to see from big organizations, I would like, whenever there are sensors in place, try to adopt blockchain and see how this changes. I would say the data governance and how are you going to share data across your users. I think that's a really important variable to consider. And by no means the technology is perfect, but I mean, that's what it is, right? We have to test it, and we have to try to make it to the next level and develop it, try to make it more efficient, I would call it.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I think that's our call to action, which is to do, hopefully keep doing this exploration. It's early days is what I'm hearing. We have a lot to pay attention to keep sharing examples through calls like these, but then also to do some real testing and experimentation, and hopefully, and that's a general principle that we're always in support of here with MobLab and with the organizations we get to support and work with, which is that that culture of testing and experimentation is important, whether we're talking about blockchain or a new a new engagement strategy or anything else. So if you are, our part of our mission here is to keep sharing good examples and lessons and learnings of what works, what doesn't work. Thank you to the 60 of you who joined live and the many others who I know will be tuning into this on audio and video later. We will remain engaged in this conversation with everyone and interested in any examples you all have and that our guests here continue to have. So a big thank you again and virtual round of applause to Daisy, Veronica, and Lee, and once again to all of you for joining. And now off to your next, to your dinners or breakfasts or whatever you are doing in your time zone. So
thank you, Mike.
Thank you again, and we'll see you online again soon.
Take care. Thank you
Appreciate
very much.
it. Okay.